Alright, so in this video, I'm going to talk in more detail about what goes into your discussion, otherwise known as your evaluation. So this forms the bulk of your report. Now remember, your word count is 1,500 words, and the only other thing that's included in that is your introduction. So your discussion starts with the interpretation. This is when you refer back to your hypothesis and say whether your results support it or don't support it. This shouldn't be too long. This is just about explaining what it is that your results mean. Now, most of the report is spent on your evaluation. This is when you're analysing and discussing the procedures and processes that we went through and determining whether it was reliable, whether it was valid, and what other things could potentially have caused our results. Now, I know I've said it many times before, but the key thing about what you say in here is that it has to be specific. We don't have time for vague and generic comments about research in general. It's all about this investigation. So you start off with talking about the sample. So the sample is a key part of it. Now, the first thing you need to do before you even start discussing the sample is decide what your population was. What group of people was the focus of your investigation on? So was it just on teenagers? Was it on everybody? Was it on people on smoking age? Decide what your population that you're looking at actually was, because you can't determine if your sample size was representative if you don't know what your population was. So you need to talk about the size. A sample size that's very small makes it very difficult to make inferences about the population. Once again though, don't just talk about it generally. Say exactly how many people were in our sample and what were the particular characteristics that made it unrepresentative of our population of interest, and suggest how this sample could have been improved. Now, one of the key things you also need to talk about is reliability and validity. Now, this might be incorporated into your general strengths and weaknesses as well, or it might be its own paragraph. Reliability and validity has to be in there. So when you discuss the validity of the results, talk about things like, was there any gender bias? Was there an age range? Did we have random selection? What could have gotten in the way of our results measuring what they're claiming to measure? Were we really measuring exactly what we said we were going to? Were our tools appropriate for measuring the data? Were our results going to be accurate? So for example, the method that we used to measure our heart rate, was that actually going to produce an accurate beats per minute? Were those questionnaires an accurate way of gauging people's attitudes? What might have gotten in the way there? What extraneous variables might have gotten in the way of our results being accurate and being what we said they were? Then we look at the reliability of the results. If we did that in the exact same way, would the outcome be different? If that's the case, which it probably is, you need to explain why. Then we talk more about the strengths and weaknesses of the design and procedures. And as I said, this might incorporate some of the things you talked about with reliability and validity. These two things don't have to be separate paragraphs. Once again, don't just talk generally about the strengths and weaknesses of the design. So don't just tell me that a quantitative observational design is more applicable to the real world than experimental. Be specific about these particular procedures. So the degree of control over the variables that we had. What did we do to make sure that things were in place? What did we do to ensure that there was random allocation? How much availability of participants did we have? Was there any missing data? Again, were all the measures that we used appropriate? What were the strengths and what were the weaknesses of what we did? Then finally, looking at those ethical issues and talking about both positive and negative aspects. Again, don't just provide generic answers. We gave informed consent. Say specifically what we did and things that were specific to this investigation. For example, maybe talking about smoking and the consequences of smoking might have been distressing to people. So think about things like that. And then finally, your conclusion. This is when you reference your original hypothesis or research question, and also where you include suggestions for improvements. Now, suggestions for improvements should have been discussed all throughout it as well, but your conclusion needs to focus on that. And not just listing really vague ones like we should do it again with a different sample size, but actually coming back to your focus question. What did you say you were trying to find out at the start of your report? Was this the best way to do it? And if it wasn't, determine what would be the best way. So if you're comparing the effectiveness of the central route versus the peripheral route, maybe your focus group would have been a better way to get people's opinions and attitudes and how effective it was. Maybe a quantitative observational study on people watching pre-existing ads might have been a better method. So think really carefully about what was the best way to address your aim and to answer your initial question.